So get that fired up. We're going to have a look at some things around the signs of the times and alignment of nations. So while that comes up, I'll say, not intending to make any political statements, so don't look for any. I'm boring like that. There's a lot of stuff ongoing, especially in the Middle East, that's very complicated, and right is often changing by the hour and by perception and motivation of those determining what right is. So it's also an environment of extreme media manipulation, and what Google says is often, depending on whether you've looked up this website or that website, will tell you totally different things. So hopefully we'll just look at, I'll say, facts and truth without getting too embroiled in the right and wrong of those acting. We'll have a look at what God says about what's going on potentially, and what that might mean for us. Also, not looking to glory in the pain and suffering of those involved in these situations. It's obviously some fairly significant humanitarian crisis in parts of the world where a lot of people are being killed or displaced. And while that might be part of God's plan, we obviously don't joy in seeing people suffer. So let's see if this button works for the first time ever. There we go. All right, Ukraine war. We'll start with the simpler one. So they're now over 600 days of fighting, and that's become just a bit of almost a footnote on the news every night. Significant casualties on both sides, most notably the Russian side, who seem to have decided their armed forces are somewhat disposable. The fighting's extremely stagnant, with basically marginal gains and losses each way. That line that you see there, it was meant to be with all the Western support for Ukraine. That line was meant to move this fighting season, they call it, basically the European summer. It's moved a little bit, but basically it's been just really slow, kind of messy fighting, in almost trench-style fighting. So that's been stagnated. There's a few hundred k's of battlefront there that, depending on who's doing what, there'll be various skirmishes along that every day. So the geopolitical situation is pretty clear. We've got Russia, who started off invading Crimea, which is the bit circled in black down the bottom, and they did that a number of years ago, and kind of the world said that's not really nice, but nothing happened. And then a number of years later, they decided they might take all of Ukraine, and that's where I suppose we are currently. So Russia is basically the belligerent, the antagonist here. Ukraine is defending what is legally recognised as their country. And you've got the West, NATO, which is basically Europe and North America, Australia, Japan, a few other people supporting the Ukraine without actually putting troops on the ground. And you've got Russia basically trying to take that territory and hold it. Turkey is very interesting in this situation, and Turkey comes up a bit. So Turkey has basically traditionally been a Russian ally. Turkey is also part of NATO, which confuses things, but we'll touch on that later. But even Turkey has suggested that what Russia's doing isn't actually the right thing to do, despite being their ally. While you've got other countries like Iran providing significant numbers of drones, and North Korea providing a lot of ammunition. So Russia still isn't calling this a war. It's still a special military operation, whatever that means. But it's not, they haven't invaded. They're there to keep the Russian-speaking people of Ukraine safe, and apparently that's what they're going to continue doing. So here's a map. This is the countries that have been providing weapons or military hardware, financial aid to the Ukraine. So you can see there's similarly a lot of the countries I've just listed previously. But basically the West is supporting that. This was a UN vote. There were 4, you can see down the bottom left-hand corner, there were 4 things that were put to the UN General Assembly, which is basically the 200 countries that make up the world, to vote on. The UN, when they vote on things, they're not actually legally binding. Nothing actually happens, but it's just a way of everyone saying we're either unhappy or we're very happy with how things are. So they voted on these 4 things, and you can see there's a map there with some colours. So blue was they voted to support all 4 of those motions. and down to purple, which was they voted against all of them. So 78% of countries voted yes, basically, across those four. There was about 20% that abstained, which generally means they didn't want to pick a side, or they had friends who they didn't want to know which side they were following, so they avoided picking a side. You'll see countries like India and South Africa who have some quite strong ties to Russia, but also quite strong ties to the West, have chosen not to basically vote in these. So India, Pakistan, South Africa, Sri Lanka all abstained, and the only countries that voted against all the resolutions were North Korea, Russia, Syria, and Belarus, who are generally in the naughty corner as the rest of the world's concerned. So it's pretty clear the world is generally against the Russian invasion or occupation of the Ukraine. And we'll get to a bit more on that in a second. So we go to Ezekiel, and it's a passage that gets taken out every now and then, especially often involving Russia. So we'll just read these verses. Ezekiel 38, verse 1. And the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief priest of Meshech and Tubal. And I will turn thee back, and put hooks in thy jaws, and I will bring thee forth, and all thine army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with the great sorts of armour, even a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. So there's a few interesting things in here. A number of translations, often the more modern ones, in verse 2 where it says chief, that the Hebrew word is rosh. At times that gets translated to be a noun, which fundamentally means Russia. Basically, every single use of this word in the Old Testament refers to it as chief, the top of something like a mountain, the head or ruler. So I'm not an ancient Hebrew scholar, but I'm an engineer, so statistics mean a lot to me. So when 99% of the usages mean that, not a country, I'm happy to go with that as the generally correct use of that. But I'm not going to get into a long argument in the hallway with anyone who strongly feels it is Russia. So, and Pastor Jock's not here to yell things at me either, whether good or bad. So Magog, I don't know if you can see on that map, it's pretty messy. It's kind of in the top right-hand corner. Magog is generally what we now call the stands. So from Afghanistan to Kazakhstan, it means kind of northern land. So it's that kind of, does involve bits depending on where you date what Russia owned. It's certainly been Russian territory, but that kind of area up in the south of Russia or through the stands. So that's Magog. Meshech and Tubal are generally the area around the Black Sea and the Caucasus. So you've got Turkey, Georgia, Armenia, and the Ukraine. Again, these are kind of ancient designations, and even back then, these guys have been fighting over this land for thousands of years. So exactly what was what and where was where changes depending on which week it is or which year it is. So again, they didn't have Google Maps to work out exactly who was where. So their general areas, the exact alignment of specific nations is, I suppose, somewhat academic, and no one can actually make any statement either way of exactly what Ezekiel meant in terms of dots on maps, but it's those areas. So here's some of those, and also in some more verses. In verse 5, it talks about Persia, Cush, Put. It says all of them with shield and helmet as part of the army with Magog. In verse 6, it talks about Gomer and all his bands, and the house of Togarmah of the north quarters and all his bands, and many people with thee. And in verse 13, it mentions Sheba and Dedan. So you can see here, Persia is basically Iran. Put is around kind of northern Africa, Libya, Algeria, Tunisia. Cush is just below Egypt, kind of on the eastern side of Africa, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Somalia. Gomer is around Turkey and Eastern Europe. Togarmah is Turkey, the Caucasus, around the Black Sea. And Sheba is Yemen, and Dedan is Saudi Arabia. Interesting that the last two, the Sheba and Dedan, or that kind of Yemen, Saudi Arabia are listed as kind of allies but not part of the attacking forces. We'll get to that a bit later, but they say thanks but no thanks, which is, well, yeah, we'll get to some of the interesting political things on that in a bit. But those are kind of the countries that are mentioned, or the areas that are mentioned. And we'll see that if you look at the areas on the map that are coloured, if we go to this slide, so on the left-hand side, that's kind of, the colouring is general feeling towards Israel. So orange is dislike, light green is not mad on them, but not trying to destroy them, and green is generally friendly. So as of December 2020, 165 of the 193 members of the UN recognised Israel. 28 of the members of the UN didn't recognise Israel as even being a country or having the right to be a country, which comes back to some of the very deep-rooted issues in the Middle East. So there's 15 members of the Arab League, which was, including Algeria, Iraq, Kuwait, Lebanon, Libya, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Tunisia, Yemen, and a few others. And then there's 10 non-Arab members of the Islamic cooperation, which included Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Iran, Malaysia, the Maldives, Pakistan, Cuba, North Korea, and Venezuela. So there's countries that basically do not recognise Israel's right to exist as a country, and that probably doesn't help peace. You'll see on the breakout map of Israel, so there's Israel is the yellow, and I'll say the green with an asterisk. So Israel is obviously a Jewish nation, and that was set up after World War I, when Jerusalem was liberated by the Allied forces. You've got, so they control a lot of territory. You'll notice at the very top of Israel, there's a blue bit between Israel and Lebanon. That's called the UNIFIL region, which is, there's actually a UN armed force, basically, that patrols and looks after that area, because Lebanon and Israel weren't trusted to have a border that they actually shared. So there's international peacekeepers basically there to stop them fighting with each other on a daily basis. At the moment, they're not having a great deal of luck because they just shoot rockets over the top of that blue bit. But there's actually a big lot of peacekeepers in the middle trying to keep the peace. So what we've got in Israel is we've got the Gaza Strip, which is a Palestinian territory controlled by Hamas. They're both a political and a military organisation. Also within Israel's borders are the West Bank, which is a Palestinian territory controlled by a different mob called Fatah. At times Fatah and Hamas actually fight each other or disagree strongly with each other, but they're kind of the semi-autonomous rulers of those areas. So Hamas is an Islamist group that by a lot of countries is considered a terrorist organisation. They won the elections in Gaza in 2007, and since then Israel and Egypt have basically sealed their borders off to Gaza. Israel fundamentally controlled the supply of key utilities and resources, being water, power, fuel, and as we've heard recently, they basically turned those off in response to some of the actions that had occurred. Golan Heights, which is up right at the top next to Syria, is also part of Israeli territory, or it's an Israeli administered area, and that was part of Syria, and they took that in the 70s when they got some of their territorial gains. And that again is a kind of an area held by Israel, but not really occupied by Israelis so much. So this is, so what we have is groups like Hamas and Fatah. While they have some standing, they aren't countries. They don't have uniforms, so to say, for their armies, and they're generally supported by a country called Iran, who is generally the main belligerent in the Middle East. So if there's trouble going with Israel, you can generally guarantee that Iran's got part of it. They provide over $7 billion in funding to militant groups a year across the Middle East. So if you look at defence budgets of some countries, they're providing about that to basically groups of guys who dislike Israel. So you've got 4 billion going to Syria, Hezbollah getting about 1 billion in Lebanon, Iraq getting hundreds of millions, that's the Shiite militias. In Yemen, which is the Houthi forces, they get tens of millions. Hamas in Gaza gets about 50 million. And Palestine Islamic Jihad, who are also basically linked to Hamas, get about 70 million. So we're not talking, a couple of crates of AK-47s that are left over from, the 1980s. They're giving them serious military hardware. They're like full, missiles with, a few 100-kilometre ranges, explosives, basically the same equipment that a modern army would have, they're giving to these militia groups to basically wage war against Israel. And so all this funding, all these weapons makes the geopolitical situation extremely complicated because they're not countries. You can't go to war with a militia group, and they're in countries who you can't, they have sovereign territory, and you can't just launch generally attacks into other people's countries, especially countries that don't like you to start with. So that's been ongoing for a number of years now. Interestingly, Russia, who's a key player in Syria and also a very strong ally of Iran, have an interesting relationship with Israel. They're one of the sitting on the fence countries with Israel. They've been actually quite friendly, and Netanyahu's actually met with Putin not so long ago, which not many Western leaders have done. So in Syria's a mess. There's a whole heap of different groups fighting each other. And basically Russia has been allowing Israeli aeroplanes, basically fighter jets, to do airstrikes within Syria and then go back and land in Israel. So they'll give them a bit of a phone call, hey, we're coming in. And they basically, the Israeli and the Russian forces haven't actually shot at each other. They've kind of been letting each other do their own thing while not really fussing with each other. So it's a really strange relationship where you're both in a country that's not yours and just allowing each other to kind of conduct strikes as you want without shooting down each other's planes, which they'd be more than capable of. So if you look at some of the numbers there of the estimated numbers in these militias, just to give you an idea, Australia has 60,000 full-time active personnel and 30,000 reservists. So there's some of these militia groups that on a good day would have more armed combatants than Australia does. To give you a vague idea, Israel, on the other hand, has 170,000 active soldiers and almost 500,000 reservists. They have mandatory military service, so basically if you're healthy and aged between a certain brackets, you are considered part of the armed forces on active reservist duty. Here is a map of US bases across the Middle East, and you'll notice there's a few interesting ones. So Saudi Arabia, who refused to accept Israel as a country, is a key US ally, with the US being Israel's strongest ally. So there's some strange kind of circular loops in some of this. There's also no support. If you look at the previous map, there's no overlap at all. There's no countries that Iran is providing support to with militias that the US has a base inside, fundamentally. Iraq's probably questionable these days, but obviously America has a long history there. So, say Syria, for example, there are about 900 US troops in Syria. Russia's got about 6,000 troops. And what Russia controls, you can see on the right-hand side, Russia and the Syrian government control the bulk of it now. That's the big orange bit. The main issues were when ISIS had a bit of a run. ISIS actually controlled almost all of Syria at one point, at which point most of the Russia and the US and the West largely got involved. You've also got at the top, you'll see there's some green and some yellow. So that some of that is Turkey has basically taken over bits of Syria. There's also Turkish groups who are fighting against Turkey, or they're Kurdish groups who are linked, that Turkey's deemed to be terrorist organisations. They're fighting against the Turkish government in Syria and have been supported by both Syria and the West through various times because they were fighting ISIS. So it's a mess. You've got America giving groups guns that are fighting America's allies and also America's enemies. So join the dots on that. It's pretty messy. So with Turkey, we'll get to that in a second. So the US also has strong ties on the bases with Qatar. So Qatar currently is the home of the Hamas leadership. They got exiled from Jordan. Jordan didn't want them there. So then Qatar said, yep, you're welcome to stay here. Qatar's looking like one of the key people who may negotiate some kind of ceasefire or humanitarian kind of pauses between Israel and Hamas, because they have this linkage to both sides. Saudi Arabia, who I mentioned, are a key military ally of America, but hate Israel. Turkey is part of NATO, so they're part of the Western, we'll call it Western war machine. They're signed up to NATO. That means if any country invades a NATO country, they have to provide military support as an ally. So that puts them in an interesting situation. So Turkey also borders Syria and controls part of it, as we've mentioned. The Turkish president isn't a massive fan of the US at the moment, and there's some comments around that. So recent comments related to the Israel-Hamas conflict said, I believe we should stop Israel, which looks as if it's completely out of its mind and lost it as soon as possible. And also, the perpetrators of the massacre and destruction taking place in Gaza are those providing unlimited support for Israel. Israel's attacks on Gaza for both itself and those supporting them amount to murder and mental illness. So that's basically pointing at America and saying, we're putting you directly in cahoots with Israel and we blame you as much, and you should be stopped. And there's a lot of rhetoric with Turkey at the moment. So we've got, so October the 7th, I think we all know, Palestinian resistance group called Hamas launched an attack that took Israel by surprise. The fighters overran military installations and just civilian settlements and resulted in the death of 1,400 Israelis. So Hamas said they launched at least 5,000 rockets during that period, basically into Israel. There was about 2,000 Hamas soldiers who basically stormed those areas in Gaza, or came out of Gaza, in vehicles, killed all the settlers in their towns, their kibbutzes, and then took about 200 hostages back across the border into Gaza. And from that, this whole thing has kicked off. And if we read in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, it says, "For yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night." And this is probably as close to a thief in the night event as we've seen. When Russia invaded the Ukraine, it was pretty obvious there was 100,000 Russians on the border of Ukraine. This came out of absolutely nowhere. No one knew this was happening. It was absolutely a surprise. And we've also got in verse 3 of that chapter, it says, "For when they say peace and safety, then sudden destruction shall come upon them." Israeli intelligence, who are basically one of the best intelligence operations in the world, and you need to be when basically every country you border wants to eliminate you, they knew nothing. They were 100% blindsided by this. And even, I think it was Friday night, the head of Hezbollah got up in Beirut and gave a massive speech, which actually said, we're not going to get involved yet, but if we need to, we will. They said, we had no idea this was coming. This was totally secret from us. This was Hamas and only Hamas who planned this. In this day and age, for intelligence services across the globe who know there's things going on with these countries, especially for Israel not to know, that's a massive surprise. And that's certainly the peace and safety and sudden destruction coming. You see there was 200 people at a music festival. You wouldn't be doing that if you thought you were about to get invaded. I can guarantee you the Ukrainians weren't having music festivals when Russia had 100,000 troops on the border. So what we've got here in, I suppose, stark contrast to the map of the Ukraine that we had for the countries. So blue is statements in support of Israel. Red is statements in support of Palestine or blaming Israel. The dark grey is a neutral statement, and the light grey is basically no formal reaction. So you can see there's a large percentage of the world that's choosing not to pick a side at the moment, which is very uncommon these days. Normally everyone's in for one or the other. So you can see, there's some significant you've got China, Russia, who haven't actually taken a side, so to say, on this issue, who are major world players. So following the initial attack, Israel basically declared war on Hamas militants and has launched a very strong retaliatory attack within the Gaza Strip. I think, as we've all heard, Hamas has an extensive underground tunnel network and has allegedly used that basically for access, but built key infrastructure under civilian infrastructure, such as hospitals, schools, refugee camps, religious buildings, to shield them, because their thought was, you're not going to drop a bomb on this to get to us because it's a hospital above. And that has been an interesting thing to see in the last week or so, that Israel has actually targeted a number of these locations, knowing that there's a high probability of civilian loss of life. And that's something that, for the Ukraine war, every time Russia hits a hospital or something, there's global outcry. Israel's basically decided they'll wear that, and they're going after Hamas, come what may, that civilian casualties are part of war, and that's not something that's going to dissuade them from targeting the leaders of Hamas to shut them down. And that's creating probably the most disruption across this scenario, is the civilian loss of life. No one's really complaining that Israel's shooting at Hamas or Hamas is fighting with Israel. It's the civilian losses are what's the political leverage and causing the issues between countries. So for war, there's always going to be some collateral, and often those levels are set very low as what's acceptable for civilians, and different countries have different thresholds. Even when countries do military exercises. So the US has an acceptable level of loss of soldiers when they do a training exercise. That's not even fighting a war. They say, when we go and play war games, we will have X number of people who don't come back. So you've got, and obviously Israel has set a fairly high threshold for what they deem to be acceptable for civilian losses in this operation. And that's something that's likely to continue, or likely to become a tipping point at some point, where some countries will remove support from Israel due to the civilian casualties. So what we've got in amongst these attacks, there's also attacks on the US military bases. In some of those ones we saw have increased. So the US military conducted airstrikes in Syria against Iranian military forces that were there, and also in Iraq. They've moved 2 US carrier fleets into the Mediterranean. So that's about 15,000 sailors. So that's probably more sailors than we own total. It's a lot of people. And they actually shot down 2 cruise missiles launched from Yemen. So that's, they're firing those a few hundred kilometres at Israel. They've basically been, Hezbollah, as I mentioned, has been shooting across the border ever since it started, and Israel's been shooting back, and that's only escalating. Israel launched airstrikes on Syrian airports. They actually happen to be civilian and military airports. So basically to stop Iran being able to land military hardware into Lebanon and Syria. So the Hezbollah leader says they prepared for all options and declared they would resort to them at any time, and the fighting would not be limited to the scale seen so far. So they're ready to go. They've got thousands of guys. You can see, so these are just some rallies. You've got Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Iranian military. So we won't read all of that. I've got a summary. So that was Ezekiel 38, which is quite long, and I'm already running out of time. So I'll read my summary. So basically, the enemies of Israel are led by a man called Gog from an area called Magog in the north. He will lead an attack on Israel and will be helped by other countries, Persia, Cush, Put, Gomer, Beth Togarmah. But then, so it basically then states that the attackers are not the people of God, who are the ones that are doomed. Ezekiel says the massed army will launch its attack on the people of Israel in their land, and God urges the enemies on in their preparations for battles because God knows he's going to destroy them. God looks to take advantage of relative peace in Israel, and they attack undefended cities and take a great spoil, which then entices other nations to get involved. Some join in and some say that they will decline. The main attack is launched. God is in control of the events and has been waiting for that. And through a range of manners, these forces are eliminated with God prevailing. So, how's it all going to happen? Not sure exactly. We know in Zechariah it talks about Jerusalem being a cup of trembling to all around about, and, being a burdensome stone to people, and there'll be people gathered against it. So there's a few more verses there from Ezekiel talking about turning people back with hooks in their jaws. So they're talking about that some of these countries aren't going to want to be involved, but God's basically going to work the situation so they're forced to. And that's what we see, with these nations that are sitting on the fence or not wanting to get involved, very much so, that they'll be drawn in whether they want to or not, because of various allegiances that they've got. The last verse at the end of Ezekiel 38, you've got, "Thus I will magnify myself and sanctify myself. I will be known in the eyes of many nations, and they shall know I am the Lord." And that's the end game. At the end of the day, God's going to have what God wants to happen. God's in charge, and all the countries will know. So, who knows what's going to happen? It mentions in 1 Corinthians, we see through a glass darkly. We don't know exactly what's going to happen, especially with prophetic things. The Bible indicates, there will be a significant Middle East conflict. Now, Middle East conflict is not something new. That's been going for hundreds of years, but it's certainly reaching a bit of a crescendo. Hamas said this was the first attack. There'll be a second, a third, and a fourth. While the Israeli defense minister said, "We will wipe this thing called Hamas, ISIS Gaza, off the face of the earth. It will cease to exist." You can't have those two viewpoints living next to each other. It's mutually exclusive. Something's got to give. It's a massively complex geopolitical scenario. Hopefully you've got a bit more of an idea about a few things. At the moment, a lot of the allied parties are standing by, watching on both sides. So I don't know if you know about ice hockey. In ice hockey, when there's two people who decide they want to fight, they're allowed to fight. And they're allowed to punch each other till either a third person joins in or one of them falls over. You'll see the referee standing there. They will literally stand there and watch while they punch each other until one of those two things happen or everyone gets bored and the fight's boring. The referees are actually allowed to decide the fight's gone for long enough and break it up. But they will just stand there until those situations happen. And that's really what the Western world's doing. Iran and the allies of Hamas, is everyone's sitting there. No one wants to get involved because as soon as a third party gets involved, it's all going to go sideways in a big hurry. So everyone's standing by like the ice hockey referee waiting for someone else to make that extra move. And who knows what will happen. So we don't know. But at the end of the day, it says now is the day of salvation in Corinthians. If we're right with God, we don't have to be worried about this or troubled by this. We put our trust in God. You talked about in Revelation, when the Lord comes back, in the second coming, there'll be no more tears, no more sorrow, no more crying, no more pain. That's the end state that we're looking for. We'll have to go through a few things to get there, but ultimately, if we've got our salvation with God, we can observe these things and we can see them happening, but we can be safe in the knowledge that the Lord will be there to look after us, and we'll leave it there.